Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. My name is Alex Weiser. I'm the Director of Public Programs of YIVO. And we're so pleased to have you here with us today for today's book talk on Credit to the Nation, Eastern European Jewish Immigrant Bankers and the Shaping of American Finance, 1873 to 1930, with author Rebecca Kobrin and with Annie Polland. I want to thank the American Jewish Historical Society for co-sponsoring this webinar with us. And for those that don't know YIVO, we're a very special place for the celebration and cultivation of Jewish history and Jewish culture. We have a library and archive with over 23 million documents and over 400,000 books, which researchers around the world use. And we do public programs like this, as well as classes and exhibitions, which bring to life the world of those collections and of this history. So thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. Author Rebecca Kobrin is the Russell and Bettina Knapp Professor of American Jewish History at Columbia University. She works in the fields of immigration history, urban studies, business history, Eastern European history, and American Jewish history, specializing in modern Jewish migration. And Annie Polland is a public historian, author, and the president of the Lower East Side Tenement Museum. So Rebecca and Annie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
It's a joy to be here with you and to be able to have this opportunity to talk about what I think is really an exceptional new book on the history of not just the Lower East Side, but the migration of Eastern European Jews to the United States. And so I am excited to have this honor of asking Rebecca a few questions about this wonderful work and to get into a discussion. And we're excited to hear from you, to hear what your questions are as well. So Rebecca, did you want to say some introductory notes first before we dive into the questions?
Sure. I think what my book tries to do is I'm always been interested in Jewish migration, understanding how there are two main population shifts in modern Jewish history in the 20th century. One is voluntary Jewish migration, and the other is involuntary, what took place, in the Holocaust. And, I'm always interested in how Jews in Eastern Europe, how Eastern Europe shaped who they were when they came to America, because they did not only bring their feather beds and their candlesticks, but they brought the ideas or their strategies for survival and success with them. And, I teach a lot of American history. And when you're teaching American history, most people are not thinking about what's going on in Eastern Europe. They think about American banking. And that's, I wanted to bridge these two fields that are rarely in dialogue with each other and bring them together.
Excellent. And I think what I'll add to that, why I think this is so important, is that even in places where we're talking about Eastern European Jewish immigration, like the Tenement Museum, and we have about 220,000 visitors each year, and we teach them about the East European Jewish immigrant and what their life was like in the tenements, but we don't have this opportunity to talk so much about what happened in Eastern Europe. Like we talk about 2.5 million East European Jews come in a period of time, and many settle on the Lower East Side. They come as families. But as Rebecca said, and Rebecca makes this really interesting point, that they don't just bring the brass candlesticks with them and the feather beds with them, but they bring ideas on how to live. They bring ideas on how to set up their families. And they're also bringing ideas about banking. And those ideas about banking become the primary concern of Rebecca's work. So, and I think one of the points you make, too, that's so important is that it's not just why they came, but how they came. So let's delve into that a little bit. Tell us a little bit about what finance looked like in Eastern Europe, because we're going to talk about specific bankers and banks in New York and in the United States that were set up by East European Jews. But as you say, they brought ideas about lending and credit and other things that were not accustomed, that were new. And so tell us a little bit about how banking and finance worked for Eastern European Jews, and then we'll talk about how that affected their passage over.
So thank you. That's a great question. So I think most people do not think it's not banking, it's credit.
Mm-hmm.
And Jews are always loaning each other money and then other populations in Eastern Europe money. This is a common thing that many people did in Eastern Europe, not just tavern keepers, right? And I would not call it banking. Mm-hmm. And Jews have specific ideas about credit and risk. Who is it too risky to loan to, or who do you just loan it to? And, I lay out in the book that the whole way that Jews approach loaning is totally diametrically opposed to what exists in the United States. Namely, first and foremost, they do not require collateral. They loan to people without collateral. Two, risk. Who is the most likely person to pay you back? Is it the Polish noble who has a lot of money and resources, or your neighbor down the street who really has nothing? So it would seem that the Polish noble who has what we would call collateral would be most likely, but he has no incentive to pay you back because he does not feel any fear of being shunned or ostracized communally by a Jew lending him money. So indeed, Jews are more likely to loan to a wide range of people. And I think it's important to understand both rich and poor people need credit. Credit is central to everyone. And, the other we'll get to, I couldn't find the map that you wanted. Anna, you can find it in the book and show everyone. But, I lay out something. So, I'm going to back up for a minute. There is a great scene in Brothers Karamazov in which there is someone who owes money, has a debt to someone, and they go and they kill them instead of paying them back. So I lay that, granted, it's fiction. It is fiction, but it shows you that it is sort of like the Wild West in Russia vis-a-vis banking. And Jews don't have access. Banking is just it's state banks. So it's only for very big state enterprises or very big industries. If you need a little money to make it through the month or to buy a sewing machine, you are not going to a state bank. So I try to lay that out. And, I do this. I talk about something that I call the pogrom principle in Eastern Europe, namely that people often don't talk about with pogroms. It was more looting than anything else. People would go into your home and take all your money and all your belongings, and in addition to the violence, but mostly the looting. So if you have money as a business strategy, it is smarter to loan out as much money as possible instead of keeping it under your mattress. Because no one knows when a pogrom is going to happen. And when a pogrom happens and they take all your money, then you have nothing. But if all your money's loaned out all over the countryside, you can call in your debts and you'll have your money again. So we'll talk about that. That is something very foreign to American banking regulators.
Right. And so this was really part of the culture and part of the day-to-day and a lived experience that had been in place really for centuries, right? So that this is developed in that chapter. I think it's the first chapter. You have these remarkable images of kvitlech that were sent to rabbis, right, by people who had loaned money out, but were worried they weren't going to get it back. Am I getting that right?
Yes. So I would love to show this audience. I have some great pictures. And indeed, YIVO is home to so many great different types of sources that I just would love, people to understand what is available to write this history. And I should just say, what's very interesting is there is not many sources to talk about what I've been talking about, like the deep-seated belief about credit, risk, all these different issues that we're talking to. So, my book starts off with a riot in front of this building, which is the Armilovsky Bank. The first time I saw it, I was on a walking tour with Annie Polland, who talked about the great history of this building that no one had written about. And I was like, why does no one know anything about the family that constructs basically the tallest building on the Lower East Side? So that is in many ways the question was planted by Annie, and I thank her for that. But it's important to understand runs on banks are very common on the Lower East Side. This is a picture of another run on a different bank. And it's important just to understand the notion of giving your money to someone else to safekeep is actually foreign to many immigrant groups, including East European Jews. That you would give your money away to someone, that you don't know personally who's not a family member is something, a learned behavior. This is it today. If anyone wants to go, this is my favorite quote. The bank fails ultimately, but now it's New York's hottest hotel. You should go there. It is a way to see the inside of the building like never before.
It's not cheap though. I will
Not
put that
cheap.
warning out there.
Yes, it is not cheap.
You
That is
cannot
the
buy
thing.
you cannot buy a drink on installment there in the same way you
Yes,
can
but
buy.
you probably need to. You need to buy a drink on installment. So I just like to say that when you say you're writing about Jews and banking, this is what most people think you're writing about, Jews and like Goldman Sachs or Lehman Brothers. But I always like to say, when you got off the boat and you were an East European Jew and you maybe had 10 extra dollars, you did not go to the Lehman Brothers to open an account. They were not interested. They were not commercial bankers. So I am talking about the role immigrant Jews played in reshaping commercial banking. How we all bank was shaped by these people. And that is what I try to do. Sorry, this is East European Jewish migration. These are some of the people we're going to talk about. Senator Yarmolovsky built that tower. Max Kobrin, we can talk about. Let me just get to the Kvitalach. What it's important. I'll talk more about Senator Yarmolovsky later. So here are the type of sources I used. Court cases. They sue each other all the time, which is a great source. And here are the Kvitalach in the boxes that I think that they're found in the Vilna. They're found in Vilna in the church, locked down. Kvitalach are petitions that people would write and then, put like what people put into the kotel, right? Little petitions that you think that by sending it to the Guttmacher, Rabbi Eliyahu Guttmacher, who was seen as an intermediary between people and God, that God would then hear. And these are petitions in which people are begging for help in getting their money back that they loaned out. And I think in many ways, this is they've never been used to actually reconstruct understanding Jews' financial practices in Eastern Europe, but it really tells you how much money they loaned, to which different groups they loaned, who paid them back, who did, obviously, if they're in Kutalach, they're not paying them back, but right, and understanding this whole world of how money lending is what Jews do, but it is a very tough business. So I'm gonna stop there. That, I think they're very poignant, the letters, because the letters talk about how they've been trying for months, and indeed, often with the Polish nobility, people are worried if nudge them too much, they might evict you from living. So it is a very difficult business to be in for an East European Jew, but with few other options, this is a very common practice among Jews in Eastern Europe.
And so we'll get to Senator Yarmolovsky and Max Kobrin and their bank buildings on the Lower East Side, but before we do, it's important to realize the ways in which these men, as you point out, not only created banks for East European Jews once on the Lower East Side because that was needed, but to rewind, these men who had become the bankers, really started out selling ships tickets to people. And so it was the work of these bankers slash ships ticket sellers that propelled the migration, right? In other words, it wasn't just you got here and now you need to save money. These men were like, as Louis Lipsky, who writes about Yarmolovsky later, calls him the magician that propelled the migration. So this huge migration of Jews, 2.5 million, in part is made possible by ships ticket selling. So tell us a little bit about that, Rebecca.
Excellent. So ship ticket selling is actually providing loans and credit because no one can pay for the whole ticket, particularly for their whole family. So ship
How much did a ticket cost? Work us through that kind of like, just so that we explain like how big of a commitment this was for people to buy a ship's ticket in 1895.
Okay, so 1895 is in 1894. They set this ship ticket. So let's talk before.
Okay.
Okay, so it vacillates, and there's often competition between different shipping lines. But a ship ticket could be $12 in January because people are not crossing the Atlantic in the middle of January, and up to $24 in June. So the business model is that you can buy tickets, for example, 100 tickets in January, and they're good for a year. So you can buy them when they're lower and sell them when they're higher. And Senator Yarmolovsky would, for example, it's $24 at the docks. He would charge $24. It a cobbler basically would probably have somewhere around it's in kopecks out like the equivalent of $118. So he could take over maybe his family, but you wouldn't want to come. That's what you'd make annually. But you have to understand you also have to buy train tickets to cross all of Germany, and it's very expensive to migrate. So to migrate with your whole family probably cost up to $500. So it's important to understand that Yarmolinsky bought when it was low, sold when it was high, ship tickets. You could change a name on a ship ticket for free, and they're good for a year. And if you cancel it, you only lose 5%. So he basically corners the market on selling ship tickets on installment in 1894. The Holland American line says that he sold more tickets than the Holland American line at the docks. So he is the main um, um, person who does this. So he loans you money to make it to America. And then when you're in America, he loans you money to make it in America. But can I show one more image?
Of course, you can show as many images as you want.
Okay, good.
And just as you're showing the image, I'll point out that just for those of you listening, the Jewish migration was primarily a family migration. Jews brought more women over, more children over at a faster rate than other contemporary immigrant groups. But still, even though you couldn't bring everyone all at once, as Rebecca was saying, and therefore you're in part because the ship's tickets were still a significant investment, and so you're spreading that out over time. So you can imagine, right, on a payday, a garment worker whose wife is at home and back in the old country, and his children are in the old country, he's going to the bank to like save money to send ships tickets for that family, and then goes back again and eventually is able to do that. But so the kind of the family separation and then reunification is a central element in understanding the East European Jewish migration as a whole. Okay, go ahead, Rebecca.
This is an ad. So, there are research for this book took place on, all over the world, basically. So this is from the Hamburg archive, and it's important. Schiffskarten is ship tickets. And it's important to understand in Germany, Yarmolinsky does not call himself a banker. He calls himself a ship ticket salesman because banking is so highly regulated in Germany. If he called himself a banker, the police would descend on him and he would be put out of business.
So tell everyone why he would be in Hamburg. So again, he's from Lumza and grows up. It wasn't just a Lumza to the Lower East Side. No. He has a significant amount of time that he's in Hamburg. So tell everyone why he would be there.
All right. So his life is like a Horatio Alger novel. He is orphaned at the age of 3 and raised by his local rabbi in Lumja, who sees that he is brilliant and sends him to the Volozhin Yeshiva, which is, might we say, the Harvard of yeshivas. He does very well. He gets rabbinical ordination. And what that earns him is a match with the daughter of a very wealthy family, Rebecca Markels, who he marries. He does not decide to pursue the rabbinate, but instead decides to move to Hamburg and set up a ship ticket sales to go into the world of business. Now, it's important to understand, and I wonder if I have a ship ticket. It's important to understand how the business of shipping is transformed in this era. Albert Ballin, the head of the Hamburg American line, you can see that's who he's selling for, right? The Hamburg Union line, the Hamburg American line. He decides to make something new, to rip out all the cabins in the bottom of the boat and make something which we now call steerage class. Very low price tickets that everyone just lives communally, and that's how they're going to cross the Atlantic. He does this because the ships going from America to Europe are filled with cotton, they're filled with materials, but they're empty going back, and you can't send them empty. So migrants become the commodity, which Albert Ballin fills his boats in. And he needs people like Sender Yarmolinsky to fill the boats because he cannot fill them. He cannot go all the way through Eastern Europe.
So and he's a German Jew, Ballin, right?
He is a German Jew, yes. He's a German Jew born in Sweden. His father was in shipping. He's in shipping. And in many ways, it's interesting to think of the relationship between someone like Albert. Ballin has a relationship with the Kaiser. He's a very elite person, but he's in many ways dependent on these ship ticket salesmen who are selling on installment. And this is what a ship ticket looks like. As we say that this is when your name gets changed. Mm-hmm. What you put on the ship ticket. This is before passports. People ask me this. There are no passports in the 1890s. Your ship ticket is where your name is. But Sender Yarmolinsky also attaches this, which translates into 9 languages They're all East European languages, exactly what a ship ticket, what you're contracting for.
So
And
this
it,
is also telling you that they're not just selling to Jewish immigrants, they're selling to a variety of people hoping to come to the United States.
yes, and I would say that East European Jews um, maintain the relationship they have in Eastern Europe with the surrounding populations. But Jews are more likely to migrate because most of the ship ticket salesmen are Jews. So people know people who are selling ship tickets, and the notion that you're going to trust a person with all your money and buy some for some of your family, and then they'll get tickets to them to bring them over later, you really have to trust this person. And a person like Sender Yarmolovsky used his rabbinic ordination. It was part of his brand. You can
Mhm.
trust me. I'm honest because I'm a rabbi. Don't you know all rabbis are honest? So it's important that that is what he did.
Mhm.
So um, this is how he sells it. I just want to see what my next. Oh, so this is his original, a picture of the original store that he opens before he built the tower on the corner of Orchard and Canal, because he has to leave Hamburg because he's not born in Germany. And the issue of residency rights are very, you can only live there between 5 to 10 years, and he's then forced out. So he goes first to Hamburg and he cannot stay. So he then moves to the Lower East Side. And that is where he starts his business of banking, right? And what he does is, besides loaning people money, right, by letting them buy a ticket and then pay them out later, which is in a sense a loan, he lets them keep deposits of a few dollars. He sends remittances overseas. And most importantly, he's open all day on Sunday when no other bank is open because he knows that's what his clients want and need. So he is tailored to the needs of his community and East European Jews.
And if I remember correctly, you write in the book too that his oldest son Albert stays in Hamburg at least for a while because he was able to marry someone who has residency. So again, you see the importance of the family, not just in like a family migration, but the way in which family and new unions and the way that marriage itself becomes part of building up a business. If you're getting dowry, right, that becomes capital that you can then use again, and then your children become elements of this network that helps all these wheels turn to bring people over. And speaking of family, I should note too that Albert Ballin's relative or descendant and relative is Charlie Scheidt, who just published a memoir called Inheritance, a beautiful memoir about understanding his German Jewish background, that his parents had fled in 39. And he's a proud member of the Leo Baeck Institute, which is part of YIVO, or in the same building as YIVO. So all connecting the dots between all of these families, and thinking about our collective history. Okay, so Rebecca, these family members come over and families are reunited due to the work of Yarmolovsky and the selling of ship's tickets. So now you're on the Lower East Side and you're a worker, you're a garment worker, maybe you're saving money to open up your own garment shop because that's, and to open up your own garment shop basically means you buy a sewing machine also on installment, and you rent a tenement apartment and you start your business, but you need a little bit of money. Tell us how Yarmolovsky's bank and Max Kober's bank and how many other banks there were on the Lower East Side, what role did they fill? Why didn't the East European Jews, once they got to the Lower East Side, why didn't they go to one of an established bank in the United States? Why didn't they go? Why weren't there American banks on Delancey Street, for example?
So I would just say the one important thing is every immigrant group has these immigrant banks.
Mm-hmm.
And indeed, in the rising xenophobia of the early 20th century, they're very suspect.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really, really important why you trust the person who sold you your ship ticket, because they have gotten you, right? There were many people who sold ship tickets who, when people got to the docks, the shipping Hamburg American line said, I have no idea what this is. You can't get on this boat. So the notion that the person who sold you the ship ticket and sold it on installment actually got you to America, you trust them. But you need to borrow money. You need to save money. You need to transfer money overseas. You need to translate documents. So in many ways, immigrant banks function uh, by translating different documents as, helping integrate people into America's financial system. Mainstream banks, Chase Manhattan exists, only operated in English and only operated in large sums. They would not transfer $1.60 overseas. So they would say they'd shut up many, many foreign-born workers who did not speak English, who often did not dress, they thought appropriately, would come in work boots, and more importantly, worked in small sums, and didn't know English. So, what's interesting, and I point out in the book, is when Senator Yarmolofsky got money, he had an account in the Chase Manhattan. So he basically charged the same interest that they charge for loans and the same interest that they caused for deposited points, because he literally is using the mainstream um, banking system, which other people can't access because of linguistic, they're linguistically barred from it.
So on the one hand, the established banks don't want to set up branches on the Lower East Side because they don't want to deal with these people. And there is an assumption too that the immigrants aren't saving money, like that this isn't like a helpful thing. But then on the other element to it is that these banks are setting up the services that are particular to the needs of the people who are coming here. And when you think about how many people that is really, really good business. So these banks grow. And what do they do, Rebecca? This is, I think, your next chapter, right? What do they do with the money, the banks, as they're gathering the money? What investments are they making in New York?
So it's important that they are very esteemed members of their communities.
Mhm.
Senator Yarmolofsky helped, literally not helped, but built the Eldred Street Synagogue. He was the treasurer at the time that it's erected.
The president, actually.
President, sorry, thank you, the president. And it's important. So they are pillars of the community, and their institutions are pillars in the community. So that is something, they're loaning money. And what I end up talking a lot about is that they offer money to invest in real estate.
Mhm.
And this is a time in which New York real estate is really dynamic, burgeoning. New neighborhoods are being erected literally within years. And in many ways, the East European Jews and, Abraham Kahan has a great scene in The Rise of David Levinsky, and everyone standing on the corner of Fifth Avenue and 116th Street look like the curb brokers in Wall Street as they trade for different lots that are near the subway are worth more. There's a lot of haggling, buying, and building up new neighborhoods that people are able to do because immigrant banks loan to you without collateral. So that is one of the things. So they help people not only invest in their businesses like sewing machines, but also in real estate in new neighborhoods that then become areas in which immigrants who've made a little money go to settle, like Harlem.
Right. So there's a real like geography to this too, right? Both thinking about kind of how these businesses help people get over to this country, then once they're here, help people actually literally build the city,
Yeah.
building Harlem, building Brownsville, building other neighborhoods that are developing as the subway lines and the transportation and the bridges are being built and that infrastructure exists. And so that it's not just that you get here. And I love you make this point too that the tickets don't, and Yarmolowski don't just help people get to this country. Once they get here, they help them make themselves, right? That they
Yeah.
continue to make and to create. There's so much more to say about things here, but before we do, I want to go back and backtrack to a point about Europe that I think you make really, really well. And I bring it up because where I'm sitting here at the Tenement Museum, I think one of the things that people understand when they come, if people who know a little bit about Jewish history, they'll say, oh, the Jewish immigrants came because of pogroms. And of course, we explain, yes, that was one of the reasons why you have so many people coming over in so short a period of time was because of pogroms and a fear of violence. And there were economic reasons that also motivated. And Rebecca, in her book, did a really, I think, stellar job of kind of explaining this relationship also. And so she doesn't have this in the slide, so I'm going to hold it up for just a
Hey,
moment.
thank you. So it's on page 45, and I hope everyone in this Zoom buys my book. All right. So basically, what I mapped out is where people emigrated from using Landsmannschaft records and where pogroms were. And where people emigrated from was actually the Northwest area, where people like Sender Yarmolofsky or Max Kobrin lived. And where the pogroms were in the southern part of the Pale of Settlement. And people are not immigrating from that area for numerous reasons, but they're more likely to emigrate from areas in which they knew, in which a ship ticket salesman lived and they knew him. Because there, as I said, there's a lot about trust. You're giving over all your money and you're trusting this person is actually going to get you across the Atlantic, and he does. So the importance of the proximity to knowing ship ticket brokers rather than just pogroms is important. So that is what I try to lay out, because we need to understand chain migration is not only because of pogroms, but it is also because of the economic links and networks that Jews have, particularly in these borderland areas. And I lay out a lot in the book that migration of Jews is extremely difficult because they don't have the right documents. So most Jews are actually migrating, or going across the border at night. I would say crossing illegally because it's illegal to emigrate from the Russian Empire. Um, and it's important they have to trust these people as agents to get them over the border. And they all live near the border. And Jews are always moving things over the border. So it makes sense that then they become central to migration. So I use this, and we can put the map down. It's, I think, an awesome map to think through, to just be thinking through of this big question. The Tsarist Empire is not good for many groups. I would say Poles also do not have a good experience, but Jews are 10 times more likely than any other group to emigrate. And how do we explain that? Pogroms are one thing, but it's also that they have options because they know people selling ship tickets, and they know people who will loan them a little money and let them buy an installment. So they have a possibility out and they take it. And that I commend, right? That Jews understand that they don't have a future in Tsarist Russia, so they're going to try something new, but they know someone selling them a ship ticket and that, or giving them this option, and they take advantage of it. So that's what I try to talk about. And it's not just pogroms, but it's also having options because economic life for Jews in the late 19th century in the Pale of Settlement is difficult. Because for one thing, the Jewish population grew from 1 million to 5 million in basically over a century. So that shows that obviously life was not so bad, but more important that there was a lot of economic competition. There are more people there. So the notion of migration being an option when you feel that you don't have a future in the Pale is made possible by men like Sender Yarmolofsky and Max Kobrin. So that's what I try to do. And they all live near the border.
And this broader culture of understanding
Yes.
credit in this way.
Yes.
So then once these banks are established on the Lower East Side and in other immigrant Jewish neighborhoods like Harlem and Brownsville and other places, how does the culture of loaning money and offering credit based on character as opposed to collateral, how is that accepted, or how is that regarded rather by the more mainstream financial and banking community? There had been a question earlier thinking about the German Jews and Lehman Brothers and others, and how, and not just them, but the kind of the Protestant establishment that has been governing banking and will into the 20th century, well into the 20th century. How do they view these Jewish immigrant banks and these Italian immigrant banks that are really functioning in a different way with another set of values?
So I think what is key to understand is that the Protestant banking establishment is extremely suspicious of immigrant bankers and their financial practices. And indeed, in the Dillingham Commission, which investigates all of immigration and how it is changing the nation and it's xenophobic, immigrant banks are discussed in the same volume as prostitution, right? Immigrant banks are seen as a moral threat to the United States. And I talk about how there is a push to regulate these businesses, to regulate immigrant banks out of business. It's important to understand immigrant banks are not chartered in the same way as a state bank or Chase Manhattan Bank. They're financial businesses, right? So there is a push to charter them and regulate them out of business, which is the story of the first decades of the 20th century. And, I talk about what opportunities did they give Jews because they are loaning on character, not on collateral. And that gives opportunities to people who are willing to take risks and might have been good businessmen, but just didn't have any collateral or capital behind them. And it gives them this opportunity to build. And in many ways, I would just say this is, the big question of those of us who study American economic history is East European Jews do move up quite rapidly, as opposed to other immigrant groups who arrive at the same time. And the question is why?
Do the Italian banks have the same approach to credit as the Jewish immigrant banks, or no?
So excellent. That's great. So the Italian immigrant banks are working with a different population. Many of the Sicilian people who come are illiterate. So the interesting thing is when you juxtapose all immigrant banks that East European Jews have bank books that you write in and the teller writes in, while Italian immigrant banks don't even have bank books.
Mhm.
So the population is very different, and the big difference is when a bank fails. The difference is in Italy, and if Italian banker, there's a run on his bank and he can't pay out, he goes back to Italy. And it becomes an issue with the Italian consulate and whether they're going to extradite him. No East European Jewish immigrant banker is going back to Eastern Europe. So they all go to the courts and they go to bankruptcy courts and they litigate it. There becomes a lot of litigation. So in many ways, the East European Jewish immigrant banks create more headaches for New York City's commercial courts than the Italian banks. But it's important to understand all immigrant banks are seen as suspect for this one main reason. In the year that it's studied in 1909, it is estimated that $300 million are sent overseas by immigrant banks back to where people are, back to Europe. This is seen as problematic because we don't want dollars leaving the United States. So the notion that immigrants are sending money, their dollars that they're earning back to Europe and not keeping them in the American economy makes these institutions suspect.
Which
And
is interesting, right? Because the Irish did the same thing. Like millions and millions and millions were going back to Ireland in the decades after the famine. And I think a good proportion of that money going back to Ireland was money earned by women working as domestic servants, and again sending it back to the families. But there's a long history of immigrants coming here, making money, sending it back, and that continues, of course.
yes,
Um, so.
yes. I just want to say immigrant regulation and banking regulation go hand in hand in
Mhm.
this period in the first 2 decades. We want to limit who's coming into the country. That's, culminates in 1924, but we also want to limit how they bank because their banking practices are seen as immoral. And I talk about that.
Yeah, no, and I want to get back to that as well. But I guess my question to you was there reason to be suspect at all? So in other words, yes, that the way that money was being lended then allows for more people in the community to have an opportunity at business success, right? So like, there's no question that there's actually a more democratic element to the way that banking was functioning in the Jewish immigrant banks and the East European Jewish immigrant banks. But was there any reason for people to be suspicious of these banking practices? In other words, were there any problems in it? Um,
I mean, I think at base, you have to understand some people are better businessmen than others.
mhm,
So banks do fail. They do fail. And there's no FDIC, right? There's no backing of banks. So when a bank does not have enough money in reserves, they cannot pay you back. And that does happen. But the big issue is what happens in 1914.
mhm.
Because no one in their wildest dreams would ever have imagined a world war engulfing Europe. So basically, all immigrant groups in New York, and it's important to understand in 1920, New York is 40% foreign born. They run to their banks
Mhm.
because they want the money that they have to be sent back to Europe to help their families there because they realize a crisis is coming. And indeed, no bank before the founding of the FDIC could ever withstand all its depositors coming in on one day. So I'm not saying that every immigrant banker was, a good businessman, and some of them were clearly fraudulent, right? But overwhelmingly, immigrant banks do give more opportunity than they are, subjecting or exploiting the communities that they're serving.
Right, and almost though, but because of the investment in real estate, it means that they have fewer funds available. So you make a point about that they weren't insolvent, but they were illiquid. Is that
Yes,
the yeah?
yes, yes.
Um, so I'm just looking at time and I know people are going to have questions and I want to make sure we get to kind of the culminating chapter of your book. And again, we are only skimming the surface. So I do echo Rebecca's sales pitch, who she's a very good businesswoman. Sandra would be very proud. You should buy this book. I mean, we're just skimming the surface, and there's so many pearls of wisdom here. And again, as Rebecca showed you the images of the sources that she draws upon, you get to understand more of that relationship with the sources and the archives once you actually have the book itself, which is so rich and so interesting. So right now I'm in a building that is part of the Tenement Museum. It's part of 103, 105, and 107 Orchard Street. That in the 1900s, these three tenements built in 1888 were purchased by a man named Joseph Marcus. And Joseph Marcus merges these buildings together. He creates a bank on the first floor, and that bank becomes successful, and he realizes he wants a to buy a corner lot. He wants to build a big, beautiful bank with marble and onyx and all of this stuff. And as you might know, the tenements were not built with marble and onyx. He couldn't take a pre-built building and transform it into a bank. And so what he does is he cuts these tenements in half on the back. It's hard to explain, but he infuses them together to create one building, 103 Orchard, and I am now in that building. But then the lot that is then next to it, he creates a lot adjacent to it where the tenement backs were. And in that place, he does build in the 19 teens a beautiful marble and onyx Bank of United States. And that bank has a fascinating history. So Rebecca, tell us a little bit about Marcus and Saul Singer. There's Joseph Marcus, and then he would pass away, and his son Bernard Marcus would take over and have a partner named Saul Singer. So how does that lead us into the Great Depression?
Great. So I just want to elaborate a little on what Annie said, because I think undercurrent throughout this, I spoke about how Senator Yarmolofsky married Rebecca Markels. Joseph Marcus builds the Bank of the United States. When he marries, it's with a dowry. His first wife passes away, and his second wife, he marries her, and with that, he builds and establishes the Bank of the United States. He changes he had a smaller bank called the Public Bank and makes a Bank of the United States. So what happens is that he's a very prudent person and conservative, but in the 1920s, you know what, I'm going to share just a few more images. Hold on. Let me just go. This is Max Kobrin's bank. Sorry, we're going through a lot of different stuff what these banks look like inside. Sorry, we're gonna switch. I think it's just I want to take for a minute. We forget how quickly Harlem is built. This is Harlem. They raise Harlem and they just build up tenements. And I told you how in 1914, no one expected the war to break out. So some of the buildings that they bought, right? This is the Yarmolofsky Bank owns these three buildings, which are the same buildings. They're all built in 1906. These are on East 119th Street because Mayor Yarmolofsky, Senator's son, heard a rumor that a subway is going to open on 2nd Avenue. And this is right on the corner where they'd have it. Indeed, he was a century too early. And therefore, he has all these buildings. That's what I'm saying. He is not insolvent. He's a liquid. So the same thing happens. This is the Bank of the United States. This is the building, right? Annie, this is, I think, the one that you're in. This right here, the Bank of the United States. Saul Singer is a man who owns a garment shop and becomes the head of the garment center owners I don't know, union. I would say he represents people who own garment factories, and they negotiate with unions to avoid strikes. But because of that job, he has that in 1918, he is responsible for moving the garment industry from being all over the Lower East Side and along Fifth Avenue to what we call the garment district now. And I want to stress, it is not inevitable that the largest manufacturing sector of New York City should be concentrated in 4 blocks. And he did it. And he built first this garment center capital, then he helped build and design numerous buildings. And because of this, he's heavily involved in real estate. Bernard Marcus, who is right here, wants to become the bank that provides mortgages for all the new construction in the garment district. So he invites Saul Singer, who's in the middle, to join him on the board of the Bank of the United States. And then they form this subsidiary company. They invest in first mortgages, second mortgages. They invest in bank stock and pump it up. So by 1929, the Bank of the United States, I think I have that, yes, has 440,000 depositors. It is the largest commercial bank in the United States. All right. And it's really important to understand it has 57 branches. This is my grandmother. She had a account in the Bank of United States.
Oh my God.
And yes,
Hortense? Does it say?
Hortense Freezer is my grandmother. I just have to say, so she files a claim after it goes bust. So she had $500. As you could see, she was a public school teacher before she got married. But what happens is when the bank closes, right? Because it does not have enough money, there's a run on the bank in December of 1930 because one person asked for his money back and the bank cannot do it. And then it creates a run. But what's really important, and we're going back to what Annie was talking about before, the suspicion of East European Jewish immigrant bankers' way. And Milton Friedman, I think, is he the next one? No. Milton Friedman makes an argument that the Bank of the United States could have easily been bailed out. It is not bailed out by this group of men. There is one Jewish man on it. It's Herbert Lehman is on this committee, but it's important just to understand that they are suspicious of how East European Jews loan to everyone, provide um, uh, funds to people without collateral. Indeed, the Bank of the United States, you could take out a loan as long as you had a deposit account. So you could have $2 in the bank and take out a loan for $100. So it is in many ways reminiscent of what immigrant banks were. But when it goes bust, there was an Italian immigrant bank, Citizens Bank, that also went belly up earlier and is bailed out. The Bank of the United States is not bailed out. Milton Friedman argues that it's because of anti-Semitism, but it's important just to understand it is the largest commercial bank failure in the United States at that time. And when people all over the country hear that a bank called Bank of the United States has failed, they get nervous and run to their bank. And in many ways, it causes the banking crisis of 1930. But more importantly, we forget that FDR is the governor of New York. And he sees that the Federal Reserve System does not work as intended. And then he does, right, the bank holiday, and I argue, thinks about what something like the FDIC could do to banking for, people. This is important to understand. Hundreds of depositors, there's 440,000, write letters to FDR. And they said, just like you're sticking up for people and having jobs and employment insurance, there needs to be insurance if we save money and work, that our banks, if they go bust, that our money is secure. So they write letters, and indeed, I think it does change the way he thinks about banking as a right of workers, just like unemployment insurance.
Right, right. And at the time of the Bank of US failure, he's governor of New
New
York,
York,
and
yes.
Lehman is a lieutenant governor. And it's important to note that both Roosevelt and Lehman want that board to bail out the bank, right? They're meeting this resistance
They
from that
refuse.
board. Hmm.
Yes, they refuse. They think that the bank caters, and I lay out in the book who it actually is catering to, and it is catering to foreign-born workers in New York, not just Jewish, but people and a lot of women, people who do not have a lot of assets, and a lot of banks who will, let them put in deposits or take out loans. And the failure to bail out the failed Bank of the United States has ramifications well beyond. The people in that room, like Thomas Lamont of JP Morgan, think that no one's going to care because it's just a bank run by immigrant Jews that caters to immigrants. Who's going to care? But everyone does care, and it has a very deep legacy, which I talk about.
Um, and again, a brilliantly written chapter. It's really, really dramatic to kind of follow this along, and then to see these telegrams from Roosevelt come through, and then also see these letters from individuals who want their money back, who think that they should get their money back, and you feel for them, right? They've saved everything, or they've saved. This is what they have for a dowry, or this is what they have for a child that they're planning to have. All of this, you see the kind of the way that people's lives are enmeshed in their access to money or their failure to have access to capital. So in addition to thinking really directly again about how this bank crash and affected the rest of the country, I want to go back to that point you made that the East European Jewish immigrants didn't just bring brass candlesticks and feather beds, but they brought ideas of how credit should work and how loans should work and all of that. And I guess I want to end by asking, how is that impacting the way that we think about money today in the United States?
So I actually think the conversation that these banks raise, we are still having today.
Mhm.
And it is about who has access to credit and who doesn't have access to credit. And indeed, now we have literally two banking systems.
Mhm.
In America, banking for those people who have access to large banks, and banking for those who like go to check cashing because they don't have access to bank accounts, either because they don't have the right documents, or more importantly, because they don't have the right funds. Like you can't open to this day a bank account with $50. So the notion of um, providing for foreign-born members of American society with access to financial services is a question that they raise. And, I talk a lot about in the end about the Chinese immigrant community because they literally have banks literally next door to where East European Jews had them a century ago. And I think about how many of the questions that Senator Yarmolовsky raised about what is fiscal morality. Is it immoral to lend to someone who doesn't have, collateral or capital, but you think has good character and you're willing to take a chance on them? I don't think so, but the way he was judged by the banking superintendent was because you should not give loans without collateral. So I think many of the questions that they raise continue to this day of who should have access to credit, how should it be regulated and who should not, and those type of things.
Right, and there's so much to say, and I won't get into it because it brings us into interesting elements of our current political system and who's in charge and how they view the government and banks. But I want to turn to questions, and so just a reminder, you can write questions into. I think you should have a tab for Q&A to write questions, and I will see what we have. Wow, a lot of them. So here's a question about. Would you comment on the indictment of Sender's sons, Meyer and Lewis, for banking fraud and the closure of the Yarmolовsky Bank? And so this is, if I remember correctly, Rebecca, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Meyer and Lewis's bank goes under in 1914, but Sender's bank does not until 1917. But maybe if you want to say a few words about that indictment of his sons and what were his sons' business practices like?
So it's excellent. So his sons are more heavily invested in real estate and cannot return. And Sender actually could, but it's important. Sender dies in 1912. He's not alive. But his bank is actually left to Lewis. And it's important to understand, I show this also with Max Kobrin, whose bank goes under, the intermingling of funds. It's sometimes, these are family businesses, and I am going to emphasize that family businesses in which different family members take from one of the institutions to another, and it becomes very confusing,
Mhm.
let me say, for understanding whose money, and that's what ultimately brings down Senator Yarmolовsky's bank in 1917, right? Because of the intermingling of funds between M&L Yarmolовsky's bank and Senator Yarmolовsky's bank. And it is the first liquidation that sees real estate and sells it as a way to pay back. So it's something new, might we say, in New York City bankruptcy. Um, I'm gonna just also, I can see some of the questions that are sent to the chat. I just want to talk about one. I don't talk as much about it, but I do talk a lot about Italian immigrant banking. And what's very interesting is there is another like Bank of the United States on the West Coast. There is a bank called Bank of America made by an Italian immigrant. And he often says his bank is allowed to grow and flourish because it's not in New York and it is not as heavily regulated as banks in New York City by the banking superintendent because New York City, since 1863, is the United States banking capital, right? And because of that, there is this greater interest in banks in New York City, and there's greater fear over protests around banks in New York City. So this is what's really important to understand thinking comparatively. If Bank of America had been in New York, it also might have not been, it also would have regulated more and perhaps even regulated out of business. So the Bank of America, which we have today, is a legacy of that. It started in California and it was less tightly looked at and examined than Bank of the United States.
There's a really neat question here that I want to bring up from Shell Silver about Sephardic migration that happens at this time, like the end of the first century in this decade. Again, much smaller than the East European Jewish, and there was a Ladino population that actually, the Ladino-speaking population that actually lived right on Orchard Street and Allen Street and right in this area. And there's a wonderful synagogue today, the Yanina Synagogue and Museum, that talks a little bit about that background. And we also talk about the story of the Confino family of Victoria Confino here at the Tenement Museum. But was there like a parallel bank structure that the Sephardic immigrants have? Did that? Okay, great.
So it's important just to understand, I want to talk numbers. So if we talk about 2.5 million East European Jews come, around 60,000 people emigrate from the Ottoman Empire. All right. And they're called Turkinos. They're called, right? So there is one bank, but they also use other banks of other groups, Spanish. There are many, I tried to say this, many different immigrant groups. So they are using other banks, but they also come through different methods, right? But they use banks, and I should say Bank of the United States has a large number of actually people from Ottoman background who have deposits there. So they are using these institutions. They do not establish their own. And that is an interesting part because of the whole business of ship tickets. They are not involved in that business. So there are three overlapping businesses. One, business of mass migration, of selling ship tickets, financial services, transferring money, and real estate. So they use these banks, but they are not creating their own banks in the same rate as East European Jews.
There's a question here too that brings us to the more of the present day. Do you see the parallels? This is from JGS PBC. Do you see the parallels between the failure of the Fed to bail out the Bank of the United States and Friedman's assessment that it was anti-Semitic, and the failure of the U.S. Treasury to bail out Lehman Brothers in 2008?
So I actually asked Ben Bernanke this question.
Yeah.
And he said that it's really important to understand this. The amount of leverage, it was like 40-1 in Lehman Brothers. And I think it was, I have to get the exact number. I think it was, they were not as highly leveraged. But there is the question also is Lehman Brothers in 2008 is a public traded company. It has the name of its initial founders, but it wasn't even run by someone. I always ask, why do we consider Lehman Brothers a Jewish bank? Because it has its name. It didn't only serve Jews. These banks are seen and constructed, and the Bank of the United States is constructed as being led by East European Jews and catering to the East European Jewish immigrant community, which I show is not true to many immigrants. So I do think that Lehman Brothers is different of why it's not bailed out than the Bank of the United States, because in the end, the Bank of the United States paid 93 cents on the dollar. So they did have the funds. So it's important just to understand, underlying prejudices and how they shape, economics. We always like to think is beyond understanding human motivations, but it's totally shaped by human motivations and understandings.
Yes. I want to also point out, I think we need to close because we're at the hour, and I'm not sure if Alex wants to make any announcements, but before we do, I also want to announce that we had a relative of Sandra Yarmolowski's, or a descendant. Sandra Yarmolowski was Barbara Shear Eason's first cousin, 4 times removed. So amazing. Thank you so much for joining, Rebecca. Thank you for this magnificent contribution to the historiography of Eastern European Jews and American Jews and American financial practices, and want to thank you for this marvelous book. You should all go buy it. I'm sure Rebecca will sign it for you as well somehow. And
thank you to Annie for leading this conversation, but also thank you for introducing me to the building in 1999 on that walking tour, and just thinking about how the built environment of New York has so much to tell us. And, I will tell everyone here to go to the Tenement Museum, because Senator Yarmolowski didn't leave us any papers, but he left us a building. So we have to think about the stories that buildings can tell. And I just thank everyone for coming and joining, and thank you, Annie, for such a great conversation.
Thank you. And I'll do a little plug if you're a New Yorker and you can join us on June 23rd, we're doing these like evening tours that are in celebration of the 250th anniversary, looking at protest movements of different immigrant groups and how they helped move our democracy forward, including a focus on the 1902 kosher meat boycott that we are able to tell beautifully at the Tenement Museum. So join us there. And YIVO has amazing programs all the time. And I will turn it back over to Alex and to Julia. Thank you so much, Rebecca, and thank you to all of you for joining from all over the world and the country. And a special shout out to my friends from Milwaukee, which is my hometown.